Blessing everyone and welcome back. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth and I'm here today with Martien Hermes and David Fisher. We are here coming from the future. We actually had recorded a series with Martien Hermes almost in Aries season, and we're here now just a few days past Cancer season, so past the solstice. And this series is about the life and work of not only Martien Hermes, but Robert Schmidt. And yeah, David, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and we thought of doing this little piece for you guys because we find it immensely important to acknowledge the source for a lot of what we have been doing here in the astrological community, not just in our channel, but in all of the astrological community that has been involved with Hellenistic astrology and uncovering all of the material that we have been uncovering for the past few decades and really bringing it to what it has become. We just wanted to bring it to you guys' awareness that these people, they were immensely important for our community, and how they contributed to all our lives being focused on what we have been focused on for the past few years. So
yeah, and I guess with that being said, we are here doing this brief intro because between the recording and Aries season and us now here at the solstice, our dear beloved, I guess, godmother of the arts, Ellen Black, did pass in between us recording and today. And we didn't mention it in the recordings, and we wanted to acknowledge that, right? That we hadn't mentioned that because it hadn't happened yet. So we wanted to mention that now and send our deepest condolences to Ellen Black's loved ones and to the astrological community. It is a deep loss. And just, give our, an acknowledgement and a heartfelt condolence before we moved on into that material and into those interviews, because it felt more sensitive it felt more sensitive to release that material after her passing. So that's what we're here to do right now.
Yeah, especially to acknowledge everything that she did in support of Robert Schmidt working on all this material. And she was a very important factor in that because she was simply trained at the same school that they both were. And I believe they were married also when they were there. So that's so they were pretty much a lifelong connection, and they were very deep into all this material. So she was a very important factor in the background of whatever Robert Schmidt was doing and presenting, and she was a very important factor in that. And I know that, for instance, the zodiacal releasing tutorial, it was said that they tested that method a year long before they published the tutorial, and Ellen Black was a very big part in that training and trying to understand what all this zodiacal releasing stuff really meant. So yeah, she was a very important support for Robert Schmidt as well, but also contributed, I think, a lot, and perhaps not always acknowledged, to whatever Robert Schmidt was doing and publishing. And of course, people listening to the tapes can hear her very often, because she very often asked questions and said that the dinner was ready or supper was ready and people could have a dessert or something like that. So she did all that. So that was a pretty big contribution. Of course, when people are married and are so close like they were, they work together very intensely.
That being said, the Project Hindsight materials and tapes, a lot of it was probably recorded, or at least a lot of these conclaves were held actually at her home, her family domicile. And so she actually provided the physical space for a lot of these things to, manifest. And she was generously offering that space. And also not only a great mind, but coordinating the sort of care and generosity as far as like just meals and space to be, bringing her family home to the forefront for these things to happen.
And it's immensely important to acknowledge all of this, because these people literally are the rebirth of these two people. Ellen Black and Robert Schmidt are the rebirth of the material from Hellenistic astrology into our society today. And if you're watching this video and you're a part of this new wave of students that have come into contact with this material, be it through Chris Brennan, Demetra George, or any other astrologer that had Schmidt as a mentor, it's because of them. They were the ones who uncovered the language behind all of this material. They were the ones who uncovered the secrets that have been buried for centuries. And this is important. This is immensely important for our community to acknowledge. And it hasn't, unfortunately, been properly acknowledged by the people who benefit from this material hugely, I would add. And I am actually a little mad, and I feel it's an important part of honoring their memory. And I think that by acknowledging this and honoring their memory in this way, we're also able to connect more deeply with what this material meant for their lives and what it means for all of our community.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I believe, I'm not sure in which tape it is. I believe it's in his introduction when he started doing his his course in basic Hellenistic astrology, that he said that he had to read a lot of stuff that was going on the internet to get acquainted with what was out there, so to speak, on this material. And he, to his big surprise, he often noticed that a lot of his material was simply used by other people without acknowledging that it was his discovery, actually. And he needed to do that because otherwise he would be blamed for how do you call that when you steal somebody?
Plagiarizing.
Right, plagiarizing the material of those astrologers. So yeah, there's something pretty nasty going on sometimes, but let's not focus on that, but focus on their immense work and the well, there was nothing known about Hellenistic astrology before Robert Schmidt started involving himself with it. So yeah,
at least in English and in the US. I mean, and I do want to acknowledge as well, like, I feel like this is kind of common. Like, I'm a teacher, not on any kind of like a deep level like Schmidt or anything, but it was hurtful for me when people would take my trainings and not say like, this is where I was trained, or this is my teacher, you know? So I do think it's just really important, even at a basic acknowledgement, to just say, you know, this is the lineage, these are the people that taught me, this is what I'm associated with. And, you know, like, thank them for, you know, however flawed or whatever you feel is just like through their transmission, it's brought to you today. So I think that's a really important thing for all of us in any lineage to acknowledge and really feel for a second.
I know that their material has changed my life. I know that it has changed the way I view the world. I know it has changed the way I think about my fate. And I had never come across with any sort of explanation like the ones that they provided me with from their own base of knowledge. And I cannot thank any other teacher that has come away the way I can thank them for that life-changing experience. Yeah.
Really great. Yeah. Of course, I had a very long training in astrology, psychological astrology. And I've talked about, I believe in the interviews, how I came to become a Hellenistic astrologer or Hellenistically oriented, but perhaps that's a better word. Well, the work over the last years are simply trying to get a grip on whatever Schmidt was promoting and talking about. And I had the same experience as David has. It simply blew my mind, because here was somebody that really tried to delve into this material and try to understand it and make it modern, perhaps, or palpable for us to understand what this was actually all about. And that was really, yeah, it was really mind-blowing. And I kept saying that in all my lectures and every video I produced on this material this is mind-blowing. This is really at the heart of where this is coming from. And because I came from a psychological astrology and all sorts of other things, I had never thought that philosophy would be such an important part of this material. Of course, in the background, it always was, of course, because you can also say that Jung is a philosopher in a certain sense. But yeah, Schmidt really brought that down to earth astrologically, and that was really an immense influence on my life. Well, my latest work, of course, people can take note of that, but it's simply all based on what Schmidt made me aware of. So yeah, a huge influence, huge.
Yeah. And so these 3 interviews, like we already, again, had them recorded this spring. You'll hear some of that where we're wishing Martien a happy birthday and things like this, which is, all the way back in Aries season. But we already felt it to be important to sort of review Martien's work because we love him as a teacher and bring Schmidt's work to the forefront. But it felt now even more important to do a sort of in memoriam, because Ellen, although like I had emailed her, she's a little, I don't know her, so she can be like unreachable sometimes, like, but I had emailed her just to let her know we were doing these, let her know she's totally, welcome to come. I know, Martien, you had phone calls with her and things like this, you knew her, but it just felt like we couldn't now just release these materials, even though they are about Schmidt and honoring his work, but without giving a small moment to Ellen being a deep part of that work, which we might not have mentioned as much in the interviews. And we also didn't want to just be talking about Schmidt without acknowledging Ellen's recent passing.
Right.
So thank you all, and enjoy the episodes to come. You'll probably get this little intro again once you pass through the video of just us introducing ourselves, but we just wanted to, start out with a quick in memoriam before you dive into the material. So have fun with those interviews, and we shall see you on the other side. Ciao. Blessings, greetings, and welcome back, everyone, to this exciting interview that we're having. Part 1 of 3 in our interview series with astrologer Martien Hermes. Very special guest. Thank you for being here, Martien.
Thank you for having me.
We're so grateful to have you today joining us for this short series. And I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth, joined again today by brilliant astrologer and friend and co-host David Fisher.
Yeah.
So just to get us started and introduce this series and introduce Martien. Martien is a practicing astrologer. We met through a talk that he gave at Adam Ellenboss's Nightlight Speaker Series a few years back when David and I were in one of his courses, and Martien came to teach a lecture there. And we were blown away by Martien's presentation at the time because we were noticing Martien's work was like a reflection or like a consistent reiteration of something that we had been studying, which was Robert Schmidt's work at the time. And so, as student practitioners of Schmidt's work, we noticed kind of that reflection, and it was super exciting for us. We were like, oh my God. So that was a moment that sprouted the seed of this dream that we're sort of flowering today. Martien was teaching in this course. Do you guys remember which one it was? What was the first lecture that you gave at Nightlight, Martien?
It was on the Hermetic laws.
Yeah, right. The Hermetic laws. And that is a good one. And for anyone interested, just to take a little divergent moment, that is posted on your YouTube channel now, isn't it, Martien?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Brilliant talks. Like, your YouTube channel has so much resource. So just before I go any further, you all can go over there and subscribe, as well as just check out Martien's work and the way he teaches. So you offer a lot of your work for free over there, and amazing, brilliant lectures, very thorough.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. They've been like, we watch them again and again and discuss and talk about them. Like David and I will watch them together, talk about bits, talk about Schmidt. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, we've been literally obsessed with the idea of having Martien here over in the channel to have these series of interviews for a couple of years already since we started studying the Schmidt material. Because we know that there are very few people still talking about it and focusing on that particular work. And to us, this is actually the base work of the modern Renaissance of classical astrology.
Or even deeper, maybe the coined the term Hellenistic astrology, even more so that like the real depth of the Hellenistic revival, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I call it
so it's very
Hellenistic astrology now, as they say, Greek Hellenistic astrology. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good term. Yeah. Okay, cool. And so we kind of, even at the time, I think we were like, oh my God, this work is so cool. And like, we thought about maybe wanting like all these questions we would have for Martien if he was ever our teacher or something like this. So I don't even know, at the time we didn't have the channel. It was just kind of a dream that we thought maybe wasn't even achievable. So like when we made this connection and friendship with Martien, and to have him here on this channel is like really wild, So fast forward, a bit of a dream come true, exploring your work and Schmidt's work here on the channel, and in the field as like fellow practitioners and fellow students studying this style.
And to me, this is a testimony of just how interesting, how nice the experience is to be in the astrological community and to have like a knowledge-based network, of people that want to come together to just explore this kind of knowledge. This is a very special endeavor to be in. And I feel like the astrology community has always given me the opportunity to connect with people that I always saw as being really high up my how do you say that?
Sort of like pedestalized, like almost like we know that they're friends and fellow students, but you kind of admire them and their work and things like that.
Yeah, and we are so used to that kind of people in the academic world and other kinds of places that are not marginalized communities of society, because the astrological community itself is. These kinds of people being inaccessible. And I feel like being in astrology is so special because the people who are really sharing the deepest knowledges are the people who are more accessible, who really want to connect with as many people as possible to share that kind of knowledge. And I find it really special in this community. And so again, thank you, Martien, for being here.
And
my pleasure.
Especially Martien, like we were like, oh my God, when you're, when people you look up to are humble and then considered friends and fellow students, is just really special. And we feel that way about this YouTube channel too, and everybody watching. We kind of feel like we are that, fellow practitioners and students. And as far as what David said about the exploration, so this 3-part series is going to be an exploration into the sort of history of, how this Renaissance developed from, and there's not just one history. This is just, one piece, one story, and Martien's gonna like shine a light for us. But the next interview, we're going to dive deeper into Schmidt, who he was, what the model of his work was. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into Martien's work, how he uses Schmidt's work, how it's the same, how it differs. And we're going to get into deeper kind of ideas. So we might start with an introduction today, a sort of setting the stage for what's to come. But in this series, this 3-part series, this being the first of 3, we're going to maybe touch even on things like fate and free will, the astrological, cosmological model, astrological frameworking and techniques, and how we personally use them. And so exploring Schmidt's work, I think for me, at least, what Schmidt did from my astrological practice is really get me to dive deeper into the words, the concepts, the modeling. And I liked his work, not because he was standing as a foremost authority, which I feel like he does have a lot of credentialing to do, but just because he was humble and asked us to like think about these things, right? Like, you know, think about the way that this would have, you know, been modeled, or, you know, so it really got me in the headspace to be able to understand astrology from in a deeper, more fundamental level. So that's, to me, why it's important to just bring this work forward. Whether or not you've studied Schmidt, you know, I would recommend listening to the lectures because they're positively amazing. But we're going to try to give a brief overview of what that, you know, what that brought to the community.
Great.
So get your popcorn, y'all, get your tea, get your water, because this is going to be fun.
Great.
So to begin interview one, I would like to just get, you know, a base of like the when and the how. So the story of, you know, and again, I want to just kind of talk about like this interview, this first one is a little bit for me because it's a little bit like I want to dig into the gossip a little bit, like more of the personal history. So the next ones are going to be like very oriented in the work. And at this point, I just kind of, I've always wanted to ask you these questions. I've always wanted to get like a personal history of the time, what it was like, because I wish I could have been there, you know? So what is the story of the time? How did you meet Robert Schmidt?
I met him when Project Hindsight started. I'm an astrologer. I started studying astrology in 1983 after a very interesting episode in my life, which was the reason why I wanted to study this material. Perhaps I can talk about that a little bit later. But so I was a sort of practicing astrologer from 1983 onwards, because before my first lesson, my first official lesson, I was actually trying to delineate charts for people. So it really took me by surprise the level of depth you could reach with astrology. That really spoke to me as something that was very interesting, and really struck a chord with me. So I did that for 10 years, but after a while, after 10 years, I was about thinking I was doing psychological astrology. And I thought I need to read up on Freud and Jung, because that was the astrology that I was practicing. And when I did that, I also came into touch with the anti-psychiatric movement that was rampant at the time. That was around the 1970s. There was a lot of criticism aimed at a psychoanalytical treatment of people. And I had some doubts about, so I was a very deep into Jungian psychological astrology, but I had one difficulty, and it was the idea of what's called projection. So whenever you have a planet in the 7th place, that's not your partner, that's just you projecting something from yourself on someone else. So when people get abused, etc., and they have Mars in the 7th place, then the idea is, well, it's merely your expectation of relationships, or your expectation of a partner. So when you get beat up by him or her, that's just your own fault, something like that. So I had a lot of difficulty with that. So at the time, I was I was asked a lot to do lectures, and that's when I started to become a bit more critical about the tradition I was in. So there was a talk that I did, does the world exist in astrology? Because when everything is projection, you are simply walking around in your own brain, right? So nothing is real, it's all simply projection. So that was the first dent in my practice as a psychological counseling astrologer. So, well, that was interesting. And that was around 1994. And then I read in the magazine by the most famous Dutch astrologer, Karen Hamaker-Zondag. Have I heard of her? Well, she lectures in all over the world. She's the most famous Dutch astrologer. And she had a magazine, and she announced the Project Hindsight in her magazine. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll subscribe to it. And then I subscribed to the Greek track, and that started off with Veges Valens. Well, that was really an eye-opener. So, yeah, I was interested in that, but then afterwards, a lot of things happened in my life, which really put me off psychological astrology. And that was really the turn for me towards traditional astrology. And one of the things that happened was that a student of mine gave me a little book because she was not interested in it. And it was by Zadkiel. And it was, I think it was called Christian Astrology, but it turned out later that it was actually a rewrite of William Lilly's book on Christian astrology. But it seemed modern because the modern planets were introduced up until Uranus. So Zadkiel worked on that material, but the examples that were in there of horary astrology was something that I had never seen before. So, and it was so meticulous, and it was so structured, and it was so well, it was so easy to follow. When you have A plus B, then you need to conclude that it must be C that is the result of A plus B together. So that was so structured, as opposed to the more, let's say, I'm quoting someone who visited Schmidt very much. He was called Spearbearer. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes.
He said that's Mickey Mouse astrology. So the Mickey Mouse astrology is actually, well, it can be anything. Well, when you see planet A is located there, then it can be this, but it can also be that, and it can be this, and all. It's all over the place. And it struck me that this traditional astrology was so structured and so straightforward that I was really taken with it. So
and Martien, just for the people who are perhaps ingressing in this field, who listen to you talk about it like that, modern astrology doesn't feel, when you get into it, being someone who studied it as well, when I started in this field, it doesn't really feel like it gives you a principle of selection for the factors that you see in the chart to laying out delineations. In other words, it gives you lists for you to memorize of significations. And then they basically tell you, use your intuition to pick out which ones you feel like are the most likely at the moment and go with it. And that's really what most of them do. Because there is no structured principle of selecting how things are going to influence each other, how A plus B equals C. It's just like into the unknown.
Yeah, and just to give them the benefit of the doubt, I'm sure some people are a little bit better than that than others, but for people that don't want that pressure of having to, like, for, let's say those people that do not consider themselves psychic or something like that, you get to it and then you're like, wait, what should I do? There's like an I there. And for me, as long as we're talking about this, I'll just give my personal experience and I think, you know, Adam Ellenboss kind of gave us this too, which is one point, like, you are not the chart, which was very liberating for me. But I come from a background of like strong ideas around fate and free will. But then the other thing is, you know, it's not that, and when you study Schmidt's work, you'll really find this out. It's not that there's no space for the oracular. Right. But for me, there's not that there's no space for that type of experience, like the intuitive experience or something like this. But for me, when you're given this range of archetypes, and then you're given these structured, like you're talking about, Martien, these tools and these filters that allow us to sort of funnel out systematically some of the choices. And when we're arriving at, you know, the A plus B must equal C answer in that space of filtering, it allows actually more possibility for the oracular to come and speak through me. And I'm just speaking personally. So when I can rely on that structure and those filters in processing through those ancient techniques that have been handed down, I actually open up more to that oracular space, instead of being flooded with the idea of like, I'm supposed to make the choice about how it's going to go for this chart. Like, I don't really need to do that. And as
it's almost as if the ancients had perfected the technology of divining.
Right.
Almost.
Yeah, and you know, and I'm coming from, you know, 20 years of a background in yoga, right, where you've got these ancient esoteric systems that if you just work the system, you have certain results, right? So for me, this was very much in that vein, where it's like you're given this beautiful ancient system, like you say, David, that if you just work the system, it works. And then it does allow for all this esoteric, beautiful sort of personal experience in oracular space. So, that's just a brief aside of what gets me excited about it, or my like experience with it, with the structure that you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Well, in no way, shape, or form I want to state that this is not functioning in traditional astrology, because I think it does. My problem was when I was working as a psychoanalytical astrologer, the problem was that I had a lot of work done with a chart, but when people came to me, I simply had to ask, where does it hurt?
Yes.
And then people started talking about that, and that was the essence of the consultation, that all the work that I did with my chart, it just went aside. So that was quite difficult for me, because I had all sorts of ideas of how to solve this. So I wrote texts for people, and then I counseled them in the session, and then I gave them the work that I had actually done as an astrologer. So not all people are meant to be counselors or psychological oriented counselors or whatever. But that was so intertwined that it was so difficult to make the difference between. Let me give you an example. My brother worked as a technician for in a tapestry factory, and he did maintenance for machines. And he was so good at it that he simply had to stand right next to the machine and listen to it, and then he was almost certain that this is wrong with this machine. And when you're working with a lot of people in counseling sessions, then you get a feel for what's happening. So people sometimes don't even have to say what's wrong. You can simply notice it by simply having a lot of experience with counseling people. So then the astrology itself is no longer needed to do that sort of counseling. So that was for me quite a difficult situation, because I thought, well, I'm presenting myself as an astrologer, but what I'm doing is counseling. So I was not pleased with that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get to the heart of, okay, so when I stop doing this sort of counseling, what's left of the astrology? What is the function of astrology in this? So that was a lot of thoughts that I had about what I was doing and how I was discontented with the astrology actually phased out of what I was doing. And that had to do with a lot of new age ideas about what the function is of a healer. That's simply to help people and assuage their pain or whatever. But I was not content with that. So and that was sort of the turn towards more let's say mechanical astrology, in the sense, okay, what am I seeing here? What's happening? And then there are these interesting stories of I'm not sure if I told this, but I'm lost. There was an Australian astrologer who's now living in the UK, and she was visited by the police because she had done some consultations with a criminal, and she did not see that in his chart, and that was quite a shock to her. So what she did, she stopped her practice for a month or 3 and started doing traditional astrology. And after that, she reopened her practice because she could see something that made people inclined towards more criminal activities. And you cannot do that with modern astrology, simply because everything in a chart is a choice.
Yeah,
right?
And that's where we're going to get into some of the like fate and free will, kind of like how that's built into the pieces of how the ancients thought, and what sort of things we need to settle on within our worldview when we become astrologers. And I just wanted to shout out to Matt from the Astrologers Encyclopedia, because we just had this conversation last night. So, I think they're going to be happy to hear us discuss it a little bit here.
I wanted to ask Martien, like, what philosophies were challenged to you, like when you started studying ancient astrology, if any?
When I started studying ancient astrology?
Yes, Hellenistic, because you psychological approach, very modern ideas, still there amongst your peers. Trying to develop some concepts that would sound more familiar to modern mind. But when ancient astrology comes in, what is the feel that you get?
Well, the difficulty that a lot of people had with me promoting traditional astrology was that it are the how do you call it, foreordail? People are prejudiced against the ancient astrology because it's depicted as being very black and white, and it's all about fate and fatalistic, etc., etc. And people are simply, when they are modern astrology, they are simply not aware of the subtlety of ancient astrology. They simply think that the outcome of some of these recipes, they are so black and white, but they are not simply the idea, well, I see this planet there, so you are doomed in that area. No, there are a lot of steps before you get to that point of concluding this. And people simply look at the results and know nothing about the methods and the principles that lay at the foundation of these talks. So that was very difficult, and I was really sort of banned. I'm not quite sure. I was a reasonably popular speaker at conferences. We had two sorts of conferences in the Netherlands, the spring conference and the autumn conference. And I spoke at many of them. And at one point I was really, how do you say it? Ostracized. Because I was speaking about the idea that all this fantastic astrology is really not founded in a tradition that is older than 50 years at the time, right? That this is about the 1990s. And my discovery was, when reading that Zadkiel book, that there were a lot of terms in it that I had never learned or had never heard about. And that was really a revelation for me, because the astrology that I had learned was really simply based on everything that was in the early 20th century astrology. But before that, there was a completely different astrology with a lot of different principles. And the things that I like to joke about is, well, the significator for the father, that's the sun or Saturn. And the idea is, the modernized version is, well, when you talk about the father as a charismatic figure, then you're talking about the sun. And when you're talking about the father as a very strict person, then you're talking about Saturn. But yeah, in the ancient tradition, it was simply, when you're born in the daytime, then the sun is the father figure. And when you're born at night, it's Saturn. So all this, all this dressing up the things that they didn't understand, that are actually unbeknownst in modern astrology at the time, well, they were just smoothed over with all sorts of new interpretations. And that's really difficult.
You use Saturn. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because even then you still see in those texts that it's not quite so black and white, because even when they give you how to select through sex the significators for determined purposes, you still get nuances like, but if one of them is cadent and it's the preferred one by sex, still give preference to the other that's more angular, or things like that in other topics. So you still have to be quite, you still have to study quite a lot of those texts to be able to capture those nuances and apply them to your practice, right?
Yeah, and David, that you're saying that too, like, first I just want to say, like, thank you, Martien, I guess, in a way, because that trailblazing, against, when you're going against, like, say you found a community that you actually thrive in, astrology, right? And then you're sort of forced to be ostracized amongst that small community. That can be a hard thing, So thanks for trailblazing and like holding space for that, because not everyone would want to sort of like challenge that with inside of their community. And it sucks that it's a challenge, but I think I know why. Like for me, when I found, like, there was something in astrology, right, that like clicked. Like my whole life I was kind of like, ooh, this clicks. And I guess I have to take into consideration that with yoga, I had this introduction to Jyotish, which is like very similar, like ancient ancient astrology. But so I had a little bit of that framework, but so I always kind of thought, there's something to astrology, like it kind of like had an allure, but it wasn't like totally there for me until I saw like, wait, there's more. So that would have been like the modern astrology versus like knowing, like being introduced to traditional, like, oh, there's more. And that's when I really got like keen to it. But for some people, I think, and I'm not saying it's intellectually lazy or what they could be used. I'm not trying to like accuse anyone, but I think when you see like, oh, you have to read these huge books written in this really archaic language, and they're telling me like, this means this and that means that, like I can see the resistance to it because it challenges fate and free will. It's a challenging practice. It is fatalistic in a way that someone would almost naturally be inclined to push back against when you have this sort of like modern idea of like what fate and free will is. So like I understand that it could be scary, and so that people sort of resisted it out of many sort of like triggers. But for me, I didn't have that trigger with it. For me, I was like interested. I was like, wait, how old does it go? And wait, what do they say? So I think there's kind of like a difference in maybe just personality, but yet I wasn't necessarily deeply clung to the astrological experience prior to that. Like I wasn't deeply like practicing for 10 years in modern or something, which would give someone probably a little bit more, discomfort with the older materials maybe or something.
Well, I was pretty early with my criticism, and I was very angry at psychological astrology. I told you about my firstborn child was born with a slight handicap, and that could not be seen in my modern chart, which with Placidus places, etc. And when I started doing traditional astrology, then it was pretty obvious that it might be a risk for my firstborn child. But my psychological worldview fell apart because no one had ever warned me about the possibility that this might happen. And at the time I thought, well, when this instrument is not telling me objectively what's going on in the life of this person, how the hell can I use it in counseling people? Because when I can simply alter any meaning that is reflected in a chart and make my own turn of it and talk about it in a very positive way, even though I'm not quite sure what it means, then that astrology falls apart. And one of the first things that went out was the infamous elemental analysis, fire, earth, etc. That turned out to be completely different in traditional astrology, the way they established the temperament of a person. So that went out very quickly, and then after that, everything went out simply because I was quite angry with the, let's say, the soothing way in which everything was presented. So I know now why I was ostracized, because I remembered what I did. I wrote a pamphlet called 10 Objections to the Predomination of Psychology in Astrology. And I can send it to you if you'd like, but it's pretty,
please. I mean, I love it.
But pretty heavy-handed, and I understand that people, and I sent it to all my colleagues, all the well-known astrologers in the Netherlands. And afterwards, I could understand why people got angry with it. And I had one colleague, that was very nice. I've worked with her, and she was deeply into Jungian astrology. And I invited, I wanted people to come discuss this with me. And she was the only one who did, and who dared do that. And I really appreciated that, but she did. And we had 2 talks in front of an audience, defending and attacking each other with everything that I said in this pamphlet. So
some of us are a little. Yeah, it's a good start. And, some of us are a little more prone to the rebel archetype, or even more comfortable in debate, like in debating hard ideas. And some of us like thrive off of that. So, I, applaud that bravery. And also, for some of us, it's a little more natural to kind of be, in the face of something when it doesn't make sense. And I just wanted to speak on, thank you for sharing your story about your firstborn, because that's one thing I've found in traditional astrology that some people might criticize. And, these days we have, we've come a long way in how we view spirituality. So like a lot of people online will use this term like toxic positivity or something like that when it comes to like spiritual movements, right? And so we have some words to sort of like characterize some of that softness that you were talking about. But for me, what's great about traditional that might be a point of contention for some is the doom and gloom, where there's a lot of times where I'll see something hard in the chart and I'll be like a little bit like, oh, that hurts a little bit. I don't necessarily want to, oh, how can I soften that for the client? Or like, and I'll use softer language, but I'll still be brave enough to, bring it up or something. And when I do, the floodgates open because they're like, wow, someone really sees me in that experience. And if you're going through difficulty, you feel validated by that. You don't feel attacked by that. So if I was to talk to you about like maybe some difficulty coming up with your firstborn child, you maybe wouldn't want to hear that if you hadn't had the child yet, right? But then once the child comes and you do experience the difficulty, then you can say like, wow, I really feel validated in that experience. Like I really feel like I got like, okay, I got a warning. And then maybe even better, what these techniques offer us is a bit of remediation as well. Not only is it like a relief that we have a little bit of way to plan around that or psychologically plan for it, but we can remediate it through that a little bit and be like, oh, these are the challenges that I've been facing. And someone saw me in those challenges. And that's an extremely validating experience,
Right. It's interesting that you brought that up because I was, I was thinking for years about, would I have liked somebody, one astrologer to have said to me, there might be a risk for your firstborn child. Such a prediction, right?
Yeah.
Would I have been glad or comfortable with that? And I concluded after many years of thinking about it, because there was no answer. And there's a very interesting book with the title, I'm not quite sure if it's the English title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And that's something that simply happens. My brother had a stillborn child, and he said to me, I have asked for many years, why should this have happened to me? And the answer is, why not? And the conclusion that I had was, well, if somebody had said that to me, I probably would not have been very happy with it, but I would be forewarned. And when it indeed, as you said, if it did happen, then I could have made a conscious choice. I want to have children, and there might be a risk for the firstborn child in my life. Okay, then I'll take that risk. Right?
And to me, it's like a very mature balance. If we're not coming out of fear, like, oh, don't tell me that, or oh, I reject that, I don't want bad things to happen to me, right? But if we're coming from a place of like, oh, and exactly, like bad things happen to good people, and that is something that we really have to reckon with in things like fate and free will and God, because it's like you could be God, right? Like hating God, resenting God for like, I did all the right things and I love my spouse and we've always wanted children. And then we had this, blessings to your brother for that hard experience. And then we had this hard experience. Why me? How could this have happened to me? I've done everything good, right? Like why does bad things happen to good people, right? And so this pushes on hard concepts of fate and free will and God and like, all of this. So I understand the difficulty that people could have. And yes, we don't want to hear bad things. And I think there is a certain psychological nature to this, modern, counseling piece that we still can use to be gracious and soft around delivering potentially hard news that people might not want to hear, right? But they are coming to you because they want help. And maybe if they're coming to an astrologer, they don't just want to talk about what's going on in their life. They want you to tell them what's going to happen in the future. Right. And so like good or bad. So maybe a little, prepared for that.
And the interesting thing is that in my imagination, some things are heavy and difficult, but people who live with it don't experience it as something as difficult as I imagined it. So people are happy under the most difficult circumstances, always. So that's my experience also. So yeah, why should I worry, right?
Right. It is.
It's interesting when you look at the chart of someone who has a lot of malefic influences, malefic aspects, and then you ask them about a certain part of their life, and they're like, and you're like, oh, this must have been important and especially difficult to go through. Hey, what did you experience here? It might have been this and that. And they're like, no, can't remember much about that period because they suppressed it. And it's something that they just integrate into their existence. And it's like, nah, I go through things in my life. I just get through with it. I don't.
And it's another thing, like if you talk about let's say some of the bad houses, like let's say you see poverty or financial difficulty.
Yeah, something just to conclude that previous thought, it was that the feeling of the chart is a familiarity to those particular circumstances, right? When you see a lot of difficulty in a chart, sometimes all it's saying is that person is familiar to that kind of circumstance, not that they are not thriving in them, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point, because let's say I see like poverty, right? Poverty in a chart, or let's say I see accident and injury in a chart, or let's say I see like suppression or imprisonment in the chart, you know, and I ask them, you know, like, it looks like the most difficulty, one of the more difficult things for you has been, you know, finances or whatever. And they're like, oh my God, I grew up in poverty or whatever. They've become familiar to that. Or I say, maybe the most difficult thing in your life could be something like health, or there could have been an accident. Oh yeah, I have a chronic illness. Or, you know, it looks like some difficulty. And I'm talking about second house, sixth house, and then 12th house. Oh, maybe, you know, it's 12th house. Have you had any psychological stuff, or, you know, have you ever, you know, there's maybe some topics of imprisonment. Oh yeah, I actually, you know, was in prison and it was a difficult time for me. So to be able to speak to, and that doesn't mean, you know, what you guys are saying is it's a natural thing for them. Like they've lived with this chronic illness. It might be hard for me to say, but for them, they've lived with that already, you know?
Yeah, they're familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead, and why don't we move back to where you kind of talked to us about in 1994, you explored the Greek track. Tell us some memories around that time, or what stands out a little bit around that time.
Well, of course, the work of Wadsworth Valens is so precious because he had so many examples, but also the techniques were unknown. I had never heard before about the triplicity rulers dividing the life into 3 portions, and later it became 2 portions. The first half of life and the second half of life, the universal principles of addressing the life of the natives as a whole. So yeah, that was really interesting. But I really got into Schmidt's work in 2008 when there was an interesting astrologer, a very young one, who simply by the method of zodiacal releasing said, in these 2 periods you found a life work. And he was right on the spot, because the first period was when I asked a guitar for my birthday, and becoming a musician has been a very important part of my life, wanting to be a musician in a band, etc. And I was in several bands. And the second one was simply a few months before I learned about astrology. So I had to learn that method, and that prompted me to get into Schmidt's material really deep. And I was helped by that by my friend in Belgium, John Timperman, who is also a very enthusiastic traditional astrologer. And we did a lot of seminars after we met in Belgium. So that stood out. That was very important. But before that, I was deep into the material of Marinus, who is a very astute astrologer. Because what I used to do was I have a yellow text marker, and I always underline everything that's very important. But his book, I believe it's book 21, is really on delineation. I kept.
I know, the same with me. I'm like, do you need to, you know, you got a good book when you're like, do you need to highlight the whole thing?
Right. From top to bottom, everything was so to the point. So, and it was such a wonderful booklet. So yeah, I was very deep into his material. And after that, I sort of went backwards in the history of astrology, because I did Marinus and Lily, that's Renaissance astrology, and then I took a course with Robert Zoller, which is medieval astrology, and then of course I came back to the Arabian astrology because there were many translations coming out on the Arab material, of course, very interesting. I studied with Stephen Birchfield for a while, and then I got back to Schmidt. So that was really back to the real foundations of astrology, and that really changed my way of looking at astrology very profoundly. So
we can all see that we're talking with a man of substance here. Okay.
Indeed. And
I just
again,
want to make that all clear.
Yeah, and honored. When you talk about Marinus, we just covered this in our Patreon book club because Dimitra George highlights some of his work, so really spot on. And sorry for that little plug. And then yeah, that video. Oh, thank you.
It was really good. I saw it. I just bought the book. I just got it yesterday because I had to come over from America. So yeah, that's really the latest book on a lot of good material on delineating charts. So.
Really, it really is. It's really laid out well. And I just love Dimitra as a teacher as well, because she's really thorough, taking you through the exercises and making sure that you get the steps piece by piece and things like that. I just have to ask, just in case, you're talking about so many translations coming out in sort of the Arabic tradition. Dr. Benjamin Dykes does a lot of translating. Yeah.
I couldn't find his name.
Right off the top. But yeah, okay. So I was wondering, are those some of the translations that you were referring to?
Yeah. That's the fellow I meant. But I couldn't get his name.
Yeah, and so
you're talking about the Persian Nativity series.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one. And yeah, they are so methodical, right? These Arab astrologers.
Very thorough.
I understand why it's so interesting for people to do that astrology, because it's so crystal clear. You do this and then you do that, and that's the conclusion. Yeah, great.
Yeah, and I was just looking
in a bit different in that, because he really, as you said, he takes you back to trying to understand what were they expressing, what were they trying to do. And for me, it was very important to get to know Plato a little bit by means of Schmidt, because he was very deep into him, and that really helped to. Because the course that I did with Robert Zoller is fantastic, but the problem was that I had, it's all these methods, and what's the underlying big philosophy here, right? So it's all sort of loose material,
and it's kind of loose because they are actually reconstructing what they can from a material that is more based on the Platonic idea.
Exactly. Yeah, this is simply methods. You do this, you do that, but why am I doing that? What does this signify in the broader picture? So that was something that really frustrated me in that course, even though it's a fantastic course. Yeah.
And I don't know if that course with Robert Zoller has been archived and still available. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to mention that, Dr. Benjamin Dykes, who's doing all of these Arabic translations, was a student of Zoller and was a student of Schmidt, and that's why I just wanted to, note that.
And please buy his books if you're into traditional astrology and Arab astrology. They are the best books around. Yeah,
I really look up to him because, he's does so many translation works, and they're so affordable. You're paying for the paper, you're not even practically paying for his, work and time. So I think he's just a very humble and a very good astrologer. And I know that Benjamin Dykes just put out a course, he's just leading the very first group. So if you're looking for that too, that's available.
Like we were saying, these people who are in the top notch of astrology, who are hands-on the material that is, being uncovered right now, they want people to know about it,
Yeah.
Exactly. And and I do too. So that's why I'm mentioning, that to the community and whatnot. But that's where Schmidt's work was kind of to me, I didn't really understand when I first started listening, because I had gotten just a few audios through a course that I was taking with Achuta Baba Adam Ellenboss over at Nightlight. And, I heard them and I was just kind of dorking out on them. I was this is kind of oracular and really cool. And I really fell into it. But if you guys wanted to and I think we're going to elaborate more on this, but Robert Schmidt's talks, like the cosmological model or the same and the other, they're really going to give you some of that like Platonic outlining. So if you wanted to go over there and just like even explore briefly, I think those are maybe a good place to start. What would you guys think? Like if you just, what do you guys think about that recommendation?
You mean Platonic philosophy?
Yeah, and just kind of how Schmidt uses the Platonic ideas to kind of give us a bigger ground, a bigger depth to, you know, the cosmological model of like why we're doing the system or something like that.
Well, the main principle is that it seems to be, that's what he said, and that's, I believe historians agree on that in that period of history, the Greeks and other people saw the the cosmos as a living being. So there is something alive there, and that something is very important to try to get a grips with. And Platonic astrology, for me, is actually the trickling down of universal and archetypal principles trickling down on Earth, in you and in me and in everybody, but they're also out there in the world. And that's something that the study of fate really expresses. You can be a really, why bad things happen to good people, you can be a very interesting, good person, but you're still out here in the world and things happen there unbeknownst to you. For instance, your body is your most closest principle of nature, and you're not always aware what's happening there, because sometimes a disease or something simply breaks out at a certain point and you were not aware of it. So that's the principle of fate, right? It's very intimate, but it's also, it can simply happen. And that was something that really interested me a lot, because that's what the world of coming to be and passing away was something very interesting for the Hellenistic astrologers, because it seemed that let's say the schools of philosophy had no means to address the issue of coming to be and passing away, because when you study the world of nature, it's too chaotic. They simply wanted to address the idea of the being and the things that were not changing at all, so that were universal or were never changing, the unmoving mover, for instance, from Aristotle. And the Hellenistic astrology is actually the method to address the idea of coming to be and passing away. Why? Simply because when you were born, you get a certain chart, but a few minutes later, that might have changed. When you were born in the late degrees of the rising image, and a few minutes later, there's a new rising image, then everything changes. So that's really fast changing. Everything is moving there, moving and changing. And that's what the astrology addressed. And that was an epiphany for me. That's the reason why they developed this astrology. So I did a course once somewhere in the school here in the neighborhood. There was a philosophical oriented teachings, and I called it astrology as a Platonic hermetic science, a practicum. That's what I said. This astrology being a Platonic hermetic practicum, because everything that's taught in the hermetic papers and teachings and writings is actually about this principle: fate coming down, things happen here. How do you address that? Well, astrology is a very interesting way of doing that. And as far as I know, it's the only method that we have inherited from our ancestors to address these issues.
Yeah, because it addresses like the animistic, like you're saying, it addresses the animistic worldview of things being alive, and it also addresses fate, bad things happening to good people, and why, you know. And so it has like a system there, and I like the name of that course because, you know, that's kind of the way Schmidt, I think, introduced it as the system of Hermes or something like this, right? Yeah. And so, you know, you talk about that course or that class, and I know that you have a Patreon where you do teaching now, but you know, I know that you have plans, or we have plans for future workshops, so people should definitely stay tuned or get on an email list for that, or just follow us. But
Yeah.
I know that you do teach periodical courses as well from time to time. If you would get sign up. So if you guys, I think, Martien, you were saying something about like once you get 10 or above students,
Right.
periodically you will lead a course again.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to like tell people that if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, like obviously there's Schmidt, Martien Hermes is available doing different teachings, and just thanks for being here as well. We're trying to bring a little bit of that spilling over into these discussions and channel. Okay.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to address something that you were saying, Martien, just to continue here the previous thought, that here in the Western mind, we lost contact with those fate principles, those more interactive, let's say, principles with the universe. Like, because man used to be more in connection with the whole to accept their fate more so than today, where capitalism in the West kind of incentivizes you to try and be anything you want to be. And then when you feel frustrated, just consume this, because it is inevitable that you will feel frustrated and that you will want to consume. So this idea, I think, is very debated against, in modern society, especially, and people want to be more adept at the psychological approach where everything is about you because of that more capitalistic present view. But when you look at, as Elsa said before, traditions like the Vedic, you see that they've kept a lot of they are very
dynamic.
There are a lot of disturbances. Like present disturbances to the techniques, to the philosophies, but they have kept themselves pretty much intact for the past 2,000 years, where they were merged with the knowledges that were being exchanged in the Mediterranean at that time, through everything that history says. I'm not going to go into it. You guys have a history of astrology video earlier in the channel. Go check that out. But then people here in the West lost that kind of worldview because of religion, because of religious persecution, political persecution, and that kind of, as you said, I think you used the term animistic, that was kind of lost in the Western worldview. So.
And I don't want to make it, I'm going to paint a really harsh brush stroke to not get too much into a deep divergence of this, but the idea of like Christianity came into this animistic worldview, and it was liberating, and there's a reason why people clung to it, and maybe Christianity could sort of like show how it like led into that like capitalistic kind of like mindset, but it was very much like the idea of fate was broken with this leader, right? It was very much like you have free will with this savior. You can sort of like break your fate, break your karmas, and have this like free will like motivation. And so I can see why at the time it would have been a really revolutionary idea, or a really alluring idea, right? To say that, oh my God, this thing that we've always known, this animistic worldview and all this fate can sort of be released or liberated to this sort of like free will idea. So I see why it caught on, but now we're seeing free will, capitalism, and that kind of thing tugging us so far away from this animistic worldview of the ancients that it can become problematic to ideas of fate and free will. And so that's what we have to bump up against when we're bumping up against ancient thought, the yogas, the astrologies of old, and these kind of like animistic societies that we, had pre monotheistic religion, let's just say,
One thing that I always talk about when talking about fate, there is a Dutch word, it's called noodlot, and the word is actually necessary fate. So that's actually about necessary results of something that went previous. And the example that I always use is, well, when you're born into a body, and the necessary result of that is that you need to feed that body. So that is fated. And when you want to feed your body, you need to have an income. So that's also fated. It's necessary result of the fact that that you were born in a body. Nobody is telling you what to eat exactly. You're totally free to choose what you want to eat, whenever you want, if money suffices. So you're totally free in choosing what you want to eat, but you cannot choose to not eat, because then you will die and you will sin against nature's law, for instance. So there is a very subtle principle going on with the fate concept, and people really smack the discussion down by always talking about fate as being something unavoidable. And in this case, it is. You need to feed your body, but it's a necessary result of something that's actually quite good. You're born here, you're alive, and you want to stay fit. So then you have to eat good food, right?
What is it? Is it for 2K by means of an Anke?
Sorry?
What is it? Is it for 2K by means of an Anke? What is the phrase?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I've never thought about it in that way, but yeah, it's sort of it's a necessity, right? The Schmidt translated ananke having to do with a spleen. When you have a broken arm, you need to set it, and the spleen is the word anankos, I believe. So it's set in a certain form that you cannot escape for it to heal. So yeah, that's something in that sense. So how did you phrase it?
Is it for 2K by means of an Anke? I am trying to remember.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I will look that up. I know what you're talking about, but I cannot say the phrase. Yeah.
It's through fortune by means of necessity, right?
Yeah, according to Tuche, but yeah, something like that. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, but it's not sticking in my head. The exact
maybe if we find it, I can like put it in the editing or something like that. But yeah, it's something very similar to that, and I like it. And I really like that analogy of it's a very simple way to sort of describe the fate and free will process. And I don't know if you both have seen, I actually did not see the whole thing, but just as another resource for the viewer, Chris Brennan and Adam Ellenboss just did a video on fate and free will and its place in astrology. So if you're brand new to this sort of idea and want a little bit of background on it, I'm sure they lay out, all the kind of conceptual framework for it as far as the history of astrologers and how we look at it or things like that. I'm sure they've laid it out over there in that video pretty well. So if you need a background, definitely check that out.
Right.
So then you started at about 1994, you're doing the Greek track. Are you at the conclaves? Are you studying personally with Schmidt? Are you studying from afar? Tell us about, how you would describe Schmidt, both personally and professionally. Just take us back to that time, like the juice of the moment, because I'm just so curious.
Yeah, well, I never met him personally, never met him in person. And I was never at any of these conclaves, but I had all the tapes. And yeah, I was really blown away by the depth of his understanding. I recall something someone said that when Schmidt spoke, it was first together with Robert Hahn. The things you have heard his tapes, right? So the things he is saying. Well, I keep saying these are really mind-blowing. When you go into them, it's opening astrology. As I said, I was disappointed with medieval astrology because I lost some bigger picture. And when I
some truth to it.
Sorry?
Because I feel like this is the feeling of truth. When you're exposed to something that is close to something true within you that you want to explore more, this is the feeling that it causes, right? It's inspiring.
Right. Yeah, Schmidt talked about the word of logos, and logos is putting things together in the sense that it makes you stop because you realize something, you have an experience. And I often use the idea of when you're reading a book and something really deep strikes you, you sort of wake up after a few moments and think, you stop reading and something is happening here. And that's what I had many times with listening to Schmidt, because wow, this is at the heart of what astrology is about, and he was so close to that. So I really thank him for opening that up for me, because I was really at a point when I had my severe crises with astrology and my firstborn daughter, etc., all that drama. I was really at the point of simply quitting astrology, because I thought, well, it's just bullshit, right? But fortunately, I had his material, and that woke me back to, yeah, there's something here that's way deeper than all this superficial stuff that I was dealing with, even though it was pretty deep at times. But this was the real heart of astrology for me. So that was what inspired me and really kept me going, even though it was sometimes under adverse circumstances, because as I said, yeah, there was a lot of opposition to what I did, but it also had to do with I'm a Ram born person, you know, so I really went at it, and I really came in.
You know, happy birthday. We're in Aries season, so your birthday is somewhere around. So happy birthday, Martien.
Thank you. Last week I turned
awesome.
64.
Awesome.
Jeez. Yeah.
So that space that you're talking about just reminds me of, like, when we're talking about animism, like things becoming alive. And it's this idea of like the epiphany, the aha moment. It's almost like some people use the word like enlightenment, and you don't have to use it in the big spiritual sense or even in the intellectual arena, but you can use it as like, aha, like I've become, like, in this moment, awake to something. And what you become, what you experience when you experience like bits of, very loosely using this term, enlightenment, is like you're turned on, you're experiencing a moment, you've become more alive in your body, you've become more like, just oracular in nature. And that's kind of what I was speaking to with this sort of system allowing you to become, into this oracular space. And that's, thank you, Schmidt, gone too soon, but for that's what, it really brings it alive. It really becomes a moment,
Right. True. So thank you, Mr. Schmidt.
Absolutely. Thank you. And
but
thank
there are still some tasks for us left, simply things that he announced that he would be talking about, for instance, in his course, but he never got around to that. So that's the task, the assignment for us, trying to get to grips with what that might mean, what that must be, what that, for instance, he was talking about that he could, in the Timaeus, he could explain to us how the prenatal lunation could be delineated simply by means of studying the booklet, the Timaeus, because the Timaeus was, of course, as he said in many talks, the leading booklet by Plato for the Hellenistic astrologers. So
let's get to work. I mean, that's basically what this interview is like about, or like,
on that note, I want to ask you, Martien, the process for becoming an astrologer for you, like, because as we just said, Schmidt didn't conclude his work. He spent decades on it, and he's basically a father of the Renaissance of Hellenistic astrology in the modern times. We are talking about material that hasn't been scrutinized this thoroughly for 2,000 years. We are talking about that. And so this is serious things. And so when you started your astrological career, you're saying you already told a little bit about that. And it was a long way until you found Hellenistic astrology, and even longer way until now you've perfected your full practice and you're being able to spread it more thoroughly, more widely, also because of internet, all of these practices that are developing. But do you find that it's easier nowadays then to become an astrologer, to be an actual practicing full-on Hellenistic astrologer? Do you see more people in the area that you started studying astrology and coming into the field? How do you think it was then when you started versus now where you started?
Well, when I started, there was very little material at hand for studying these specific forms of traditional astrology. So the work of Benjamin Dykes and all the other translators. Now there's a deluge of material coming from Arab sources, from Latin sources. So that's really interesting and really important. So that was a big difference. So the material was very scarce when I started doing traditional astrology, except for all the material from Project Hindsight. And in the Netherlands, it was, I'm a bit out of touch with let's say the elite of Dutch astrology, in the sense that there are a lot of people doing astrology and they are very important in the Dutch community. But they have heard, of course, of traditional astrology, but they're simply on their own track and they're doing what they like best, and that's fine. So I'm not quite sure how broad in the Netherlands the use of Hellenistic astrology is. Everybody has heard about traditional astrology, because that's what I'm shouting about pretty loud over here. But
and it's such a tiny place that if you shout loud enough, everyone can hear from all around, right?
Yeah.
I'm in Brazil. This is why I say this, guys. Don't take it personal.
Well, the problem is the problem is that I started to I've learned a new language of astrology, and it's very difficult to communicate with my fellow astrologers who have not went through that process. So I feel a bit alienated simply because we're not talking the same language anymore. So that's been a bit of a I feel alone.
Oh, well, you're in good company now, Martien. You're on some kind of pedestal in our world.
And I'm very happy with that. But it's also been in my nature to be on myself. My wife always calls me a scientist in his study up there, high, divorced from everything around him, and simply studying all this material. And I'm a bit of a loner in that sense. So, and it suits me fine, but the connection with other people around me is sometimes a bit solistic for me. So, and that happened in the astrological community as well. And that also had to do with the first reaction, because I really had the idea when I learned about this astrology, now I have something real to say about astrology, because this is such deep material and so essential to astrology. How come my modern colleagues have never heard about these terms, are never interested in what this actually signifies? So that really felt a bit difficult to have the experience that people wanted to ostracize me, because I thought
you discovered what a lot of
sorry. Yeah. That's when I wrote the song about Lily.
I know. I wanted. Okay, so this is one of my questions, right? And then, okay, so a couple of things that I wanted to just pick out there. I think for a lot of people, like for myself included, I'm a very ninth house person. I'm very okay. I'm very private. I'm very okay with being outside of the spotlight. Yeah. And, you know, there is a like comfortability there, just me and my books and me and my concepts. But there's something about the engagement, you know, when you talk about even just being in partnered relationship, like there's only so much personal growth that you can do. And then you introduce a family member or a partner and you see, you know, where your shortcomings are. Right. So then it's the same with astrology. Like there's only so much you can do. Like I know that I've learned so much by engaging with David and other, you know, students, that we as astrologers are sort of natural hermits, a lot of us in personality, withdrawn, studying. And I think, you know, part of the vision with, you know, me pushing myself to do this channel and become more public is so that we can engage, even if it's the few, to sort of push ourselves in these concepts and help each other with these concepts. And then, you know, maybe withdraw back into our little hermit cave, but be able to sort of, you know, brush up against each other, you know, socially for the loneliness factor, maybe, but also just for the love of the techniques, because, you know, we're in this balance group, David and I. And just being able, like, there's one thing reading balance by myself, and then there's another thing reading balance with 5 people, is sort of, you know, bouncing these ideas, and it does really grow you. So I'm really glad that on some level, the dynamic has been brought forth into the public enough to where we can have some community around it, you know?
Yeah, I'm really happy with it, because indeed the internet opened a lot of possibilities to reach out, even though you're not meeting people personally. but you can do so like we are doing now. So yeah, that's great. And I really appreciate it. So, and
And I feel like being ostracized is part of the process of finding something that is really truly inspiring also, because when you provoke people's spirits with something that is awe-inspiring, those people who have shut down that particular part of their spirit in order to cope with the dissonance internally that they had to cope with in order to make sense of the lacking material that they had to work with, they are not going to be happy about being confronted with that demon that they buried a long time ago. And thus they ostracize anyone who comes up with, hey, you know, your system that you've been using for the past 20 years, how about an update? They're going to be like, fuck you, let's burn you. Because that's how it goes. You know, people.
Yeah.
I don't want to say no names, but we all know that there has been some online witch hunt about house systems happening lately, because there's people slandering other people's work out of pure, spite. Like I don't want to face what you are proposing. I literally don't want to read anything that you wrote or hear anything that you have to say, unless I will attack it, from all sides involved. I don't think anyone is a saint, but we all know who I'm talking about.
And I think that idea that you're bringing up, David, as well, about like marginalization, let's say, is like, astrology was a thriving part of an animistic worldview, and then when it sort of got alienated to the side with this sort of monotheistic worldview or something like this, or the free will kind of like movement of the mind, we did get sort of like pushed into like astrologers as like it being, marginalized, because it was just like, you were a quack or whatever. You were just like not all there. You were like on the sidelines. So I think, and a lot of people as well, like that are drawn to the occult, are kind of mercurial and kind of Saturnine in general, or even Mars. Like we're okay with some of the rebel kind of debating kind of qualities. So I think that's that is innate in us astrologers. But what I loved about Schmidt's work, and what I feel like he really brought, is, we're talking about all these translations and the sort of revival and all these debates, which I think are like, mostly good, but some are totally, derailed. But what I liked about Schmidt's work is that he did have this academic, like, he did have this background in, learning, being educated, I guess you would say. But he came with all of his tools of academia. So he's a mathematician. He was a scholar in Greek language as well as others, I believe. But the way he brought this to life, I guess you could say, was not totally just academic. It wasn't like translate the material, read exactly the words, and there's nothing there, right? Like there was because of his education, his skill, his deep work in the field. It wasn't just like, here's the words, this is what they mean. It was actually like, here's the words, and actually they're extremely multivalent, and this is maybe how they were thinking. So it became alive in an academic way, but in a more embodied way, because of that sort of precision of academia. It allowed like more space for it to become alive, at least in Schmidt's work. And that's what really is beautiful to me, is like marrying those two, because I really appreciate both, right? I appreciate really good critical thought, and I also appreciate that really good critical thought can lead us to these really powerful unknowns and animistic spaces. So
it would take a Greek scholar to be able to dive deep into the concepts within the astrological text, but not only a Greek scholar, they would have a Greek language, they would have to be familiar with the philosophy, because even the way that they constructed the things that they taught was very specific, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. He had an introduction when he did his conversation about the so-called problem of houses in ancient astrology. He talked about his schooling. He was really a big brain, because he was selected for the MIT. He got a scholarship, but he refused to do it, and he went to another school where he could learn Greek, etc., philosophy and all that. So Yeah, he had a very long-standing career in simply reading Greek texts during all his adult life on a daily basis. But he found in Greek astrology texts that were written in a way that he had never read before. Simply the cryptic sense in which they wrote things. For instance, when he's talking about the formulation of how to calculate a lot of fortune, he always said, well, the reason why they do it so unclearly is that they want to express something. They do not want to give away the principle firsthand, but they want to hide it somewhere in the text. So it's there, but you have to reach for it. And the not so, let's say, ardent student reads over them and simply moves on to the next part. And that's what we as a modern astrologer have learned. Explain us the method and then how to proceed with it, and then we do it. But that's not how the Greek texts were written on astrology. So that was really his discovery, and he was quite surprised by it, simply because he had always read Greek texts all his adult life, but he stumbled on something in these astrological writings that was quite unfamiliar to him. So that was his great discovery, and that was the point where he started introducing very interesting concepts in this astrology, because he simply asked, why were they using these words instead of other simple words that were quite ready at hand for these Greek-speaking people? Why did they use this term and not the simple one?
Yeah.
And that led him to the restoration of Hellenistic astrology.
Yeah, and it's really beautiful. And I wanted to kind of, that reaching that you described, that sort of make the student reach, that's like sort of, there's a principle in like the occultism world, right? That those hidden multivalent layers, are there to sort of protect, or, there's lots of reasons why they might have done that, right? And I don't need to like elaborate on those. But for me, a piece of that is, with reaching, it forces you to become alive in it, right? It forces you to use your own mechanisms, your own internal mechanisms to reach for it. Where if someone just tells you A is B or whatever, it's like you won't necessarily become alive to it, and you won't even really understand it. You're like, why is A, B, and equal C? And then you'll have all these questions as a student. But if they make you dig and reach and sort of just twist a little bit for it, it's almost like a yoga, right? Where it's like you're getting there in an experiential way, then you're more likely to erupt at an aha moment in the real true nature of the thing, right? And you can experience that in human connection, right? It's not like you go to someone with a list and you're like, this is all my qualities and this is all my whatever. It's like part of it is unfolding that mystery, unblossoming that relationship, getting to know that experience. And so there's a reaching there, and that's part of what makes it alive and enjoyable. And I guess that again talks about that animism, right? That something is alive and you have to work to understand and get to know the thing, or whatever. Maybe not work, maybe that's the wrong word, but I think you guys get where I'm coming from.
I would say work.
Yeah, okay.
Just out of the principle of applying energy onto something, in order to,
Okay, good. Then we can use work. That works for me. So I guess let's start to move into a conclusion. So if there's anything more that you guys want to say, but otherwise I'm going to start to bring us into conclusion with some like more lighthearted questions. And so
I was just going to say that if you're all enjoying this content, you should like this video, share with your friends, visit Martien's channel, which is going to be linked below. Visit all of our pages here, follow us. We're always going to be posting more and more content on these matters, on these subjects from now on. And Martien Hermes also has a huge collection now of really rich material that he talks about, right, Martien, and the Schmidt study and all of that on your own channel, and a Patreon page. And so really help us spread the message and get people to know this deep material that we're trying to get more people talking about, so we can grow in our community.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And we're coming, with a part 2, which is going to be an overview of Schmidt's work. So, if you want, we will link the Schmidt stuff below, but like image and original, same in the other cosmological model, those would be great places to start with the work. I mean, obviously there's a chronological way to move through the work if you're going to move through it all. But if you just want like a little review before we get together next time, you could start there. As well as, the third piece to this interview is going to be going over Martien's work. So, check out his very thorough, and I think very, if you are a Hellenistic astrologer already, or if you have some kind of a traditional background, Martien's videos are going to be accessible to you. You don't have to, they're going to be accessible at like a ground level or a beginner's, level, because you really come with a beginner's mind. And I really like that. So there's so much work available on these things where if you want to study up before the next interview so that you can sort of play along, please, there's lots of resources for you to do that. So I just wanted to ask you, go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is you are a musician. And you wrote a song. Was it to Lily, to Schmidt? Tell us about that.
No, it was, I did that in one of my early talks when I started moving towards traditional astrology. And at that time, John Frawley, I'm not sure if you know about him, but John Frawley was a very funny astrologer. He had the Astrologer Apprentice was a little magazine, and that was the first magazine that had me laughing out loud sometimes when I read about it. What he wrote was really funny. But he had coined the phrase, the real astrology. And well, I learned that sort of astrology via William Lilly. So I wrote a song about William Lilly with the music of Laila from what's his name? The famous guitar player. I don't know. You know it.
Jimi
Right?
Hendrix?
No,
Laila. We don't know.
Laila.
I know, but I can't think of it.
Yeah,
I'm bad on my spot like that.
Forgetting his name, but I wrote it in that tune, and it's about William Lilly.
It's so beautiful. Like I loved when I went to your channel and I saw that you wrote a song for your astrologer, because I'm really into, like honoring my teachers, and I have like a lot of bhakti spirit. So I was like, oh my God, I found it to be the sweetest thing. So check out that song. It's really beautiful and amazing. And we are familiar with John Frawley because Adam Ellenboss teaches a horary course, and he was a student and apprentice in the sort of John Frawley method. So, he had us using John Frawley's work and method when learning horary astrology. So we're familiar with that. And then I wanted you to talk just a little bit before we conclude. We talked about this when we started prior to pressing record, but you have this beautiful background. Tell us about this background just briefly, because I thought it was really beautiful.
Yeah. This is the disc of Nebra, it's called. Nebra is the place where it was found. It is a bronze plate, which certainly, as you can see, depicts the moon and perhaps the sun, but it could also be the full moon. The Pleiades are there. You can see it.
We see it. Yep, just above. Yep.
The six of 7 stars of the Pleiades is the
yeah,
English...
Pleiades. Yeah, and some people call it the 7 sisters or something like this, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting part is that this was from a Bronze Age culture, and found in Germany, of course, and that was really an epiphany, because people thought that these people were simply farmers or hunters or whatever, and they were not that interested in these phenomena. But this Nebra disc, they built a museum around it, really. So it's a very, you can, when you type in Nebra in Google or whatever, you can find the history of this book, because it was also interesting that this disc was found, but it was kept secret because people wanted to sell it for a lot of money. And eventually the people trying to do that were arrested. And that's sort of a detective story, how that went about. But, well, it's now found and researched, and it's a beautiful thing. Beautiful. And this is the unrestored version, because they put a the sun disk, you can see that there's a part missing, so they restored that, and it's really beautiful.
It is really beautiful. And I have this, deep interest in deep history beyond just astrology. And, we do see in I don't know, this could be way off for some people, but Graham Hancock's work, we're exploring, and he's just one of many, but exploring this deep history of humanity. And we see again and again, right? Like not just in these golden and bronze ages or whatever that you have behind you, but we see that cosmology and the stars were a deep part of our history as humanity,
Right.
So, and it doesn't matter what culture you look, you'll see that. And so I just I loved that you have that behind you and just exemplifying that sort of that vibe. So
Yeah, pretty, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Martien, for being here. This is an honor and a pleasure, truly, and so much fun. David, thanks for being here as well, of course. And and so thank you all for viewing and watching. I hope you all come back for part 2 and part 3, which will be forthcoming. And we look forward to it.
Hi.
Thank you, Martien. Thank you, David. Thank you all. And all the links and everything will be below. So until next time. Ciao.
Bye.
Ia mata o kaka bersama yo kena soba da soba kena mata iba nakau di mawa kena soba and soba ate iba nake au chuno ba ikana kamaya ta onga ita